Hello everyone, just as a quick note, there was not much available pictures of the tank in today's video, so there would be pictures shown more than once in this video, as I delayed this for far too long. And if another problem like this was to arise in the future, then I will from here on in adopt the same policy for those videos. But with that out of the way, on with the video. The Vickers Valiant tank of World War II can be best described as an object of disappointment. It was designed in the 1940s for the British Army to replace their older tank designs, such as the Matilda II, the Valentine tank, and the earlier versions of the Churchill tank. As these tanks at the time were either being plagued by early issues like the Churchill tank, or being quickly rendered obsolete in the near future like the Valentine and Matilda II. And given the fact that many of the British tanks at the time were often remarked as being substandard, as many of the newer designs that would have been in production were delayed due in part to the British military, whom often operated at a snail's pace when it came to changes, which had a nasty effect of delaying various designs as the factory spaces and materials was often occupied for the production of older tanks, and so the production of new tank designs were initially relatively slow. But as the situation in Europe descended further into chaos, there would be an increase in efforts to design a new tank, which was further boosted by the failure of the Dieppe raid, where the Churchill tanks that were fielded were butchered on the beaches of Dieppe after their tank tracks had been damaged by the stone beaches. There would be many individuals and companies that would often submit design proposals in response to requirements that were drawn up by the War Office. One of the companies that would submit their designs came up with a design that, on paper, looked very impressive for the time, but in practice it was a rather shoddy design that would end up being absolutely terrible and outright painful to operate, to the point where during its mobility tests, the crew testing the tank stopped halfway while heading to the firing range, on the orders of the officer in charge, with the officer deeming the tank to be unsafe to continue any further testing. The tank was then subsequently taken back to the workshop to figure out what was the cause of a litany of problems that were encountered during the test, in which a test report would be subsequently filed, with it describing the design of the tank as utterly failureless, which is a feat that very few tanks in history would be able to achieve. Now, how did this tank come about? Well, the tank originated from an order that was given to manufacturers by the Ministry of Supply in 1941 to 1943, in which it was requested for them to design a tank that would be replacing the aging Valentine and Matilda II tank, which as previously stated was becoming increasingly obsolete by the newer versions of German tanks and anti-tank guns that often featured cannons that could penetrate the armour of their aging British tanks from longer ranges, like the 88mm flak gun, along with the increasing presence of German tanks that featured more armour like the later versions of the Panzer IVs, Panthers and Tiger tanks, that rendered the equipped 40mm 2-pounder gun on the Valentine and Matilda II tank ineffective. This order from the military was made after several discussions within the British Army from 1941 to 1943, with regards to the decision on whether to make further improvements to existing lines of infantry tanks, or for the creation of a new set of designs that would be designated as assault tanks to replace the older infantry tanks. Now, for clarification purposes, the classification of an assault tank is an American terminology used by the US Army, but this class didn't really have any solid definitions for what would be considered an assault tank, as the various literature and even the British Army reports themselves were confused on what would be considered an assault tank. But the main key features for a tank to be designated as an assault tank was that it was to have the equivalent armour of a heavy tank and the equivalent main gun of a medium tank, At least this is what the characteristics can be inferred from tanks that were designated as assault tanks, like the M4 Sherman Jumbo and T-14 assault tank. This tank designation, however, wouldn't be used outside of World War II. The ministry would eventually settle on the decision for the designing of a new tank to replace the older infantry tanks, as there was a practical limit on how much more you can improve the older tanks without a significant redesign. There would be various companies that would start submitting their designs, and the three notable ones was the American T-14 assault tank, designed by the American Locomotive Company, the British A38 Excelsior, made by the English Electric Company, with the latter tank having its roots in another program that the company taken part in, which was an earlier tank development program called the Cromwell Rationalization Program, which was an attempt at taking an existing cruiser tank design, in this case being the Cromwell, up-armor it so it can replace the Churchill infantry tank, but that'll be a topic for another video in the near future. The Vickers Company would also throw their hat into the ring with the A38 Valiant tank, which was to be a direct replacement of the Valentine and Matilda II tanks. The A38 design had its roots in a few other previous but rather obscure designs that Vickers Company had drawn up earlier. In 1942, the tank board, after evaluating the performance of the Valentine tank, made a request to the Vickers Company to design a new improvement to the Valentine tank. 3 months later, Vickers would create the design for the tank that was given the designation of Vampire. Hardly anything exists on this tank, as Vickers themselves would stop working on the design, as they believed they were going to be drawn into the production of the A27 Cromwell tank. In the very next year, in 1943, when the last Valentine Mark 11 was beginning to cease production at the end of the year, there would be another design that Vickers drawn up that was meant to be the replacement for this tank, with this new design being given the designation of Vanguard. Not much is known about this tank, but the few details that do remain was that it was going to be weighing around 16.5 tons. It would have a top speed around 23 miles per hour, or 36 kilometers per hour. It would carry a crew of 3, and it would be mounted with a 57mm 6-pounder gun, along with one 7.92mm Baser machine gun. A pilot tank was apparently built, but very few things exist about this particular pilot tank, since testing was quickly cancelled, with the reasoning being given was that the suspension was deemed unsuitable. No other further details of this tank exist. The A38 design would be somewhat based on the previous designs, but it would feature a few key changes. The A38 design would put a focus on making a tank with the thickest amount of armor at the lowest possible weight, which meant that the tank's internal space had to be made as small as possible. This tank on paper would be better than the Valentine tank in a few categories, with the biggest one being obviously the armor. The armor thickness of the front of the hull was listed at 4.5 inches or 114mm thick. The sides were 4 inches or 102mm thick, with the rear being around 3 inches or 76mm thick. And for 1943, the armor thickness was still relatively decent. And to further improve the effectiveness of the armor, the tank had also featured a rather unique hull design for British tanks. At the front of the hull featured a pike nose design, which improved the protection offered by the armor by a considerable amount, whilst being fired straight from the front, as the armoured plates were angled to an almost triangular pattern. This hull design would later be featured on the later Soviet IS-3 and T-10M tanks. All this impressive armour of the Vickers Valiant tank was achieved at only the weight of 27 tons, which was rather impressive. But this meant that there was a massive sacrifice to the internal space of the tank to achieve the lower weight, and this would come to bite back the designers and the poor crew who had to operate the tank in the near future. With regards to the specification of the A38 Valiant tank, the tank's length would be around 5.34 meters, width being around 2.82 meters, and the height being around 2.13 meters. The A38 would be equipped with a 6-pounder 57mm main gun, which for the time in 1943 was still a decent gun against current German armour, and much better compared to the older 2-pounder gun, although the HE shell for the 6-pounder was noted as being quite terrible, due to the lack of any explosive mass within the shell. The main gun would also be accompanied by two coaxial mounted 7.92mm Beta machine guns, which would assumedly be mounted in the turret. The engine that would power the Valiant tank was a General Motors 210 horsepower diesel engine, which was rather weak as it only gave the tank a top speed in tests of only 12 miles per hour, or 19 kilometers per hour, and on cross-country terrain, the speed was estimated to be a pedestrian 7 miles per hour. The construction of the prototype tank would be started in 1943, with the military first ordering a prototype to be built, and as soon as it would be built and pass through the test trials, the military would then place an order for 500 tanks to be built. But midway through the construction, Vickers themselves would drop the project. The project would be passed around to different companies, like the Birmingham Railway Carriage and Cart Company, before it was subsequently passed on to Ruston Hornsby, who finished the work on the first and only prototype of the A38 Valiant tank, which was completed in 1944, with the tank being heavily modified during the process. Testing would be followed shortly thereafter, and it would become arguably and perhaps the most worst few days for the test crew. And after it was only driven for 13 miles during its suspension test while it was on its way to the firing range for firing trials, it was decided by the officer in charge that the vehicle was unsafe for continued testing, due to the sheer amount of problems that were found operating the tank, and the crew, notably the driver, being exhausted, with the driver during the test having to be switched out for someone else due to exhaustion. The prototype tank would be towed back to the workshop to figure out some of the technical problems with the vehicle, and all these problems were then noted in the test report that was dated the 7th of May 1945, and it was rather damning in regards to the viability of the tank, with the test report listing the design as utterly failures. The amount of problems that were encountered with the early testing of the vehicle was so fast that the fighting vehicles proving establishment decided that there would be an indefinite halt on any further testing or development upon the Valiant tank. Within regards to the problems that were identified with regards to the design of the Valiant tank, the first one was of ground clearance, as the tank's whole original design specification laid out that the ground clearance would be around 44 cm at the front, with the rear being around 36 cm off the ground. But due to the weight of the tank pushing down the suspension unit, especially after the modifications that took place between its construction, the ground clearance was reduced to around 25 cm at the front, with the rear being only 22 cm, making the tank extremely prone to getting stuck or damaged whilst travelling over uneven terrain, small mounds or rubble. Another problem was that during the driving trials on road, where they were checking its performance and the comfort of the crew operating the tank, the test crew began to notice that the oil breather was beginning to spew out oil. This caused them to suspect that an oil leak had sprung, but upon later investigations, it just turned out to be an overfilled engine oil tank. The cause for the overfilled state of the engine oil was due to the lack of any measuring sticks for the engine's oil level, which was the kind of thing that would be important for any vehicle to have. But the problems didn't end there, as there was a worse fate for one of the test crew, which was then experienced by the poor souls who had to actually drive the tank, as the problems were quite simply hellish. Firstly, the steering levers of the tank were found to be extremely heavy to use, which didn't go well for the driver's arm, as it took around 140 to 160 pounds of force to operate. Plus, when the gear lever was in first gear, it would be behind the batteries, and to disengage the gear required the help of a crowbar, as it was very much impossible for a human hand to do so. And if the gear stick was positioned in 5th gear, then the position of the stick would be right up close to the steering lever, which often came back with enough force to risk breaking the driver's wrist. The clutches were also found to be too heavy, which caused problems in transitioning between different gears, and things for the driver didn't improve there, as the design of the Valiant tank has seen a large amount of space being reduced to make the tank as light as possible, resulting in the driver's compartment being extremely cramped and uncomfortable to sit in. The driver had to sit in a hunched position when the driver's seat was lowered, and when the driver's seat was raised, with his head out of the driver's hatch, his head would be only a few mere inches away from the edge of the turret armor, and any sort of rocking back and forth of the tank would result in the poor sword hitting the back of his head on the turret. But perhaps one of the more darker and morbid of all the problems was that in order to operate the brakes, the driver would have to use the heel of his foot to push down on the pedal, and had his foot slip between the two pedals, his foot would then become trapped, with the only way of getting him out being theorized was that they would have to chop off his leg, with this last rather morbid problem making the job of driving the tank an occupational hazard. And it comes to no surprise with all the problems now listed, that this report was the final nail in the coffin for any further testing of the Valiant tank within the military. The Valiant tank would then be sent to the School of Tank Technology, in which it was often rolled out on occasion in front of the officers of the school, where they would be asked to point out all the problems with regards to the tank design that they can see, which continued until 1950, when the tank was then withdrawn from both the Ministry of Supply and the Tank School, where it was then subsequently sent to the Royal Armoured Corps Tank Museum, which most people nowadays know the museum as the Bofton Tank Museum, where it remains on display today. There would however be another attempt at designing a further improvement on the tank. On February of 1944, there were some reports circulating that another variant of the Valiant tank, called the Valentine II, was being designed. This design would use the same turret and frontal hull design of the Valiant tank, but it would merge it with the hull and suspension unit of the A38 Excelsior. The armour thickness of this tank would be around an impressive 9 inches or 230mm of armour at the front of the hull. The size would be around 5.5 inches or 140mm thick, with the armour of the turret being around a staggering 10 inches or 254mm thick, which for reference, the frontal hull and turret armour on the Valiant II would be much more thicker than the Tiger tank that weighed around 75 tons. In comparison, the Valiant II had an estimated weight of just only 42.2 tons. But at this point to some guesses that the tank would most likely be cramped, suffering the same problems of crew comforts as with the original Valiant tank. The other changes would be that this tank would be equipped with a V8 400 horsepower Rolls-Royce Meteorite engine, which was a cut-down version of a V12 600 horsepower Rolls-Royce Meteor engine. The tank would also be equipped with a much better transmission and steering units from the A38 Excelsior, which would make the tank at least a bit more mobile than the original design. The main armour of the tank would be a choice between the 57mm 6-pounder gun, a American version of the 75mm main gun, a 95mm howitzer that was used on the Centaur and Churchill tanks for close support, or a machine gun turret with multiple machine guns. But this design wouldn't see the day of flight outside of the reports. and it wasn't confirmed if the construction of this variant had started, as the demand for a new British infantry/assault tank would ultimately be fulfilled by the later production variants of the Churchill tank, and by 1945, with the war entering in its final stages, the project was then entirely dropped. And that was the history of the A38 Valiant tank. Thanks for watching this video. If you like this content, please put a like and subscribe to get more videos like this. If you have a vehicle that you want to know about, let us know in the pinned comment section down below.